It was supposed to be a low-key night. My boyfriend and I wanted to do something outside for the first snow of the year, so we decided to build a bonfire on this patch of wooded public land just outside of town. We'd been there before during the summer. It was a popular hangout, but in the dead of winter, it was deserted. We packed some beers, snacks, and our camping chairs, threw some logs into the back of our truck, and headed out around 9 p.m. It had snowed steadily all day, so the trail leading into the woods was blanketed in white. We were able to drive right up to the edge of the clearing. When we got out, everything was muffled, like the snow was soaking up every sound except for our boots crunching through it. The clearing was a wide, circular path with a ring of big rocks people had obviously used for fires before. The snow around it was pristine, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there recently. We dumped the firewood onto the ground and cracked a couple beers. It took us about 20 minutes to get the fire going, and soon we were sitting in our camping chairs just relaxing and enjoying the quiet. For the first half an hour, it was great. We talked about all the things that we hoped to do that winter, and took turns throwing more wood on the fire. But then out of nowhere, my boyfriend got quiet. "You hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said. He held up a hand to shush me, tilting his head toward the trees. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the wind and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of the snow. "Animal?" I said. My boyfriend nodded, but he didn't look convinced. About an hour in, we ran out of the firewood we had brought, so my boyfriend volunteered to gather some branches from the edge of the clearing. He disappeared into the dark with his flashlight, leaving me alone by the fire. A few minutes passed, and I started to get curious where he had gone. I couldn't see his flashlight anymore, and he wasn't making any noise. I called out his name, but he didn't respond. Then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like someone stepping on a branch. I called out again, standing up. No answer. I turned on my phone's flashlight and started toward the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, just inside the tree line, completely still. His flashlight was off. "What are you doing?" I said, walking toward him. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't facing me. He was turned away. I reached out to touch his arm. He spun around so fast I almost lost my balance and fell backwards. He looked super pale and his eyes were wide. I asked him what was wrong, and that's when he whispered to me, "There's something out here." I asked him what he was talking about, and as quietly as he could, he explained that he had seen someone out in the woods watching us. I tried to stay calm and asked him if he was sure or if maybe it was a shadow or something. He said no, and that they had been crouched down right over there and pointed deeper into the woods. He said when he shined his flashlight on them, they moved behind a tree. He had turned his flashlight off to not give away his position and asked me to do the same. Part of me wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, but the look in his eyes stopped me. I said we should pack up and leave. We hurried back to the fire, tossing our stuff into the back of the truck as quickly as we could. As we were about to leave, I froze. There in the snow at the edge of the fire pit were footprints. They came from the edge of the woods all the way up to the fire, circled around to our stuff, and then went behind our truck. They weren't ours. I pointed at them. Neither of us said a word. We ran until we reached the truck, but stopped at the sight of the passenger door hanging wide open, with someone leaning into the vehicle going through our things. My boyfriend screamed at them. The person immediately stood up and looked at us. We couldn't see their face because it was so dark, but we could see their outline and that they were holding something. Suddenly, they started sprinting toward us. We ran around to the driver's side of the truck, and the person just kept running past us back into the woods. We both got into the truck through the driver's side door, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. When my boyfriend tried to drive out of there, the tire started spinning in the snow, and I could feel this wave of panic start swelling up inside of me when finally the tires caught and we started to speed away. I kept glancing out the back window. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the taillights, but I couldn't tell. We have not been back to those woods at all, even during the summers since. I moved into an apartment in early January. The lease was cheap and the building was old, but it was just me and I didn't need much. The landlord had mentioned that the tenant next door, a woman, had lived there for over a decade. Keeps to herself, she'd said. Real quiet. At first, it seemed true. I rarely saw her, and when I did, it was only briefly, passing each other in the hallway. I'd nod, maybe mumble a hey, but she never responded. She wasn't unfriendly, exactly, more like she didn't notice me at all. Then, about 2 weeks in, I started hearing things through the walls. My bedroom shared a wall with her apartment, and late at night I'd catch faint noises, like murmuring. It was hard to tell. It wasn't a TV or music, more like someone talking to themselves. The first time I noticed it, I brushed it off. The walls were super thin, and this was a city after all. But as the nights went on, it got weirder. I'd hear long, rambling strings of words, always in the same low tone. Occasionally there'd be laughter. The laughter was strange though, like when you hear someone pretend to laugh at something they don't think is funny. The only way I can really describe it is it sounded like really low, fake laughing or something. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to something loud, thumping, like furniture being moved. It stopped after a few minutes, and I rolled over, annoyed but too tired to care. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. I started noticing patterns, thumping around the same time, followed by long stretches of silence, and then the murmuring would start. I told myself it wasn't my business. She was probably just an insomniac or eccentric or something. But then I started noticing things outside of her apartment. The door frame was scratched up, like someone had been clawing at it. Sometimes when I'd walk by, there'd be a smell, something sour and metallic like old pennies. And then there was the trash. Every few days there'd be a black trash bag sitting outside her door. I never saw her put it there, and I never saw her take it out, but it was always gone by morning. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard a noise through the wall right behind my head. It sounded like breathing. I went completely still, turning off my phone's screen to just listen. It was faint, but it was definitely there. A soft, rhythmic inhale and exhale just on the other side of the wall. I just laid there, staring at the ceiling until the sound stopped. It was so strange. For me to hear it, she must have been literally against the wall, like how you would be if you pressed your ear against a door to listen to the other side. A week later, I came home late from work. It had snowed that day and the hallway was dark and freezing. The radiator must have gone out again. I was fumbling with my keys when I noticed her door. It was cracked open. The hallway was dark and there wasn't any light coming from her apartment. It was just completely black in there. But the door was open enough to see a bunch of trash piled on the floor just inside the door of her apartment. Papers, food packagings, and clothes strewn everywhere. Another black trash bag was sitting just outside the door, untied and open. I told myself to just go inside my own apartment and lock the door, but I couldn't help myself. I quietly walked over and listened through the open door, but heard nothing. Then I leaned in closer, trying to see what was inside the bag. That's when I heard it. A whisper, like someone was trying to stay hidden, coming from the darkness inside her apartment. "What are you doing?" I jumped back so fast, I dropped my keys. I couldn't see her and there was no movement. "Sorry, I stammered, grabbing my keys off the floor. There was no response. Finally, I muttered something about having the wrong apartment and darted inside my place, slamming the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept expecting to hear something, the murmuring, the thumping, anything, but it was dead silent. The next morning, when I left to go to work, I found something outside my door. It was a single sheet of paper folded in half. When I picked it up and opened it, my hand started shaking. It was a drawing, completely basic, done in pencil, but it was clearly me, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and behind the wall next to my head there was a figure drawn dark and in heavy strokes. I know it seems extreme, but I broke my lease and moved out 2 days later. I'm not doing the greatest job at explaining how it made me feel, but it was so incredibly unnerving and unsettling that I knew I couldn't live there any longer. When I handed over the keys, the landlord asked if something had happened. I lied and said that I had gotten a job offer in another city. As far as I know, that woman still lives there. I'm not a fan of the city. I live here for work, but I try to get out as much as I can to clear my head and reconnect with nature. I grew up in a rural area, and that type of place has always been more my speed. So oftentimes, when I go on vacation or just need some time off, I rent a cabin in the woods and enjoy the solitude to recharge myself. A coworker of mine mentioned their family owned a cabin upstate and offered to let me rent it for cheap sometime. I figured what the hell and decided to take some time off. The cabin was about 3 hours from the city, tucked away in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story structure with a tiny kitchen, an old wood stove, and a bedroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. But it was clean, quiet, and exactly what I needed. I arrived in the morning with enough groceries and firewood to last me through a long weekend. There was no cell service, but the cabin had a landline in case of emergencies, which gave me some peace of mind. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it reading, catching up on some work, and staring out the window at the snow-covered trees. By the time the sun set, I was curled up by the old-fashioned wood stove, and I ended up falling asleep without even eating dinner. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I sat up on the couch and looked over at the clock on the oven, which said it was 2:38 in the morning. I just figured I woke up because I had to pee when I heard it. A soft, scraping sound coming from outside, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. At first I thought it might be a branch or an animal. It was directly beneath the kitchen window that sat above the sink. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. I stood up, walked over to the back door, double-checked that it was locked, and flipped on the backyard lights. There was nothing, but it was windy, so I convinced myself it was the wind blowing around some branches or something, and let it go. I went to the bathroom and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some fresh air and immediately noticed footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I'd barely been outside since arriving, and they were too big to be from an animal. They led from the tree line to the cabin, circling it once before disappearing back into the woods. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was a distant neighbor or someone from the area who was checking on the house because they saw someone was staying here. I went back inside and double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. That night, I built another fire and poured myself a glass of wine, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Outside, the wind started to pick up again. Around 11 p.m., just as I was starting to fall asleep, I heard a loud thud from the front porch. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped. I was pretty out of it, but immediately got up and grabbed the nearest thing I could think to defend myself with, which was the fire poker near the stove. I walked over to the front door and listened, but I heard nothing except for the wind. I leaned and peeked out the curtains on the window nearest to the door, trying to stay hidden. I didn't see anything at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I could barely make out a dark shape on the porch, laying there. I turned the front porch lights on and was completely confused. It was a log. Someone had left a single piece of firewood on the porch, right in front of the door. I backed away from the door. As quietly as I could, I walked to the phone and called the landline for the sheriff's office. The dispatcher told me the nearest deputy was at least an hour away. That next hour was the most intense thing I've ever experienced in my life. Just pure adrenaline running through my body. My mind kept racing in a loop, thinking about the footprints, the firewood, and the scraping sound from the night before. Eventually, a sheriff's deputy did arrive, but it was for nothing. Whoever had come to the cabin was gone, and there was really nothing else for the deputy to look at besides the footprints and the piece of wood on the front porch. The deputy stayed with me while I packed my things, and I left before the sun even came up. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, where I returned the cabin keys to my coworker, who I could tell did not believe what I was telling him when I recounted the experience. I've thought about that weekend more times than I can count, trying to make sense of it, but I never have. I don't know who left the wood or why they were there. It really scarred my love of escaping to the woods to get my head on straight, and unfortunately I don't do it nearly as much as I used to.